Nobody saw it coming. Not the cardinal seated 3 feet to his left. Not the senior officials who had arranged their schedules around what the agenda described as a preparatory prayer session. Not the photographer positioned discreetly near the doorway, whose job was to document these moments, and who, when the moment arrived, simply stopped, lowered his camera, and watched. What Pope Leo XIV did in that room lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. It produced no sound. It required no words. And by the time the sun went down over Rome that evening, it had been discussed on every major news network on the planet. His critics, and there were critics, found that they had nothing to say. This is the story of what happened, and of what it meant. The morning that preceded it had begun the way his mornings always begin, in darkness, before the city woke. In the private chapel of the Apostolic Palace, where the only light was a single candle and the only sound was whatever a man carries into silence when he has been carrying things for a long time. He had been awake since before 4. Those who worked in close proximity to him had learned in the 10 months of his pontificate that this was not a sign of difficulty. It was simply how he was built. Robert Francis Prevost had always gone to the early hours for the things that required his clearest attention. As a young Augustinian, as a bishop in Chiclayo, where the mornings came in over the Pacific with a particular quality of light he had once described as the world practicing honesty before anyone is watching. As the prefect of the dicastery for bishops, managing the appointment and review of the Church's most consequential leaders across every continent, the pattern never changed. Only the weight of what he brought into the silence had changed, and it had changed considerably since May of the previous year. The pressures on him were not abstract. They were specific, and they were accumulating. The College of Cardinals was due for a full meeting in late April, and several of its members had been communicating their concerns through the specific channels that institutional men use when they want their objections registered without their names attached to them. The conservative bloc within the Curia had been patient for 10 months. Patient in the way that people are patient when they are waiting for a moment to move, not when they have accepted the direction of travel. The reforms being implemented were real. The appointments being made to key dioceses in Europe and Latin America were telling stories about where this pontificate was headed. The tone being set on migration, on technology, on the distribution of decision-making authority away from Rome, these were not rhetorical positions. They were structural changes, and people who had built their careers on the existing structure understood them as such. And then there was Holy Week. 2 weeks away, the most sacred span of days in the Catholic liturgical year, a period whose ceremonies had been shaped over centuries into a form of sacred theatre, beautiful, historically freighted, globally visible. The preparations were at peak intensity. Coordinators, liturgical officers, security officials, diplomatic liaisons, all of them managing the intricate choreography that turns the streets and basilicas of Rome into the center of the world's attention for 8 consecutive days. The Pope had a different idea about at least one of those days. He had been discussing it with his closest advisors for weeks. On the morning of March 20th, he decided it was time to stop discussing and start doing. The meeting had been called for 7:30 in the Sala del Consistoro, one of the formal reception rooms in the Apostolic Palace. 14 people. Department heads, senior liturgical coordinators, Vatican officials whose roles placed them at the intersection of the sacred and the institutional. The agenda was clear: a preparatory prayer session to open the final planning phase for Holy Week, followed by logistical discussion. Routine. Important, but routine. The Pope entered at 7:42 without his usual staff. No aide, no secretary. He wore simple white vestments. He greeted the people in the room quietly, by name where he knew them, with a brief nod where he did not. He took his seat at the head of the table. Someone opened the prepared prayer booklet. The room settled into the specific readiness of people waiting for something familiar to begin. And then, before a single word was spoken, he stood up. He moved away from the chair. Not toward the table. Not toward the people in the room. He walked toward the center of the open space between the table and the far wall, beneath the painted ceiling that had observed centuries of institutional deliberation. and he stopped beneath a simple crucifix hanging on the wall, partially in shadow, unlit. Then, he lowered himself to his knees on the bare stone floor. The room did not gradually quiet. It stopped, instantly, completely. The particular stopping of a group of people who have simultaneously encountered something they were not expecting and do not have a category for. Cardinal Luciano Rossetti, seated closest to the Pope, later described the sensation as a kind of sudden pressure, as though the air in the room had changed density. He said he could not initially understand what he was feeling, and then he understood that what he was feeling was the weight of something genuine. The Vatican photographer near the doorway lowered his camera. He did it without thinking, without instruction, without any communication from anyone else in the room. He simply understood, in whatever part of a person processes these things before the conscious mind catches up, that a lens between himself and this moment would be a kind of insult to it. Nobody timed it consciously, but 4 minutes and 20 seconds of absolute silence in a room of 14 people in the middle of a working morning at the Vatican is an experience that registers in the body as something much longer. Several of those present would later describe sensations that they reached for medical language to explain. Warmth, a prickling in the hands, the involuntary straightening of the spine. A senior official from the dicastery for divine worship, a man with 32 years of Vatican service behind him, a man who had moved through 3 pontificates with professional equanimity, said afterward that he had found his own hands folded in front of him on the table in the posture of prayer and had not noticed the moment when he moved them there. The Pope's lips moved slightly. Whatever words he was forming, they produced no audible sound. They were addressed to something the room could not see and had no official protocol for acknowledging. He did not prostrate further. He did not make any visible gesture of distress or supplication. He simply knelt, with his hands together and his head slightly bowed, in the quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has gone somewhere inside themselves that public life rarely permits. Then he rose. Slowly, with the particular care of a man of 70 rising from a stone floor without assistance. He did not rush it. He completed the act with the same full intentionality with which he had begun it. He walked back to his chair at the head of the table. He looked at the 14 faces looking at him, and he said, in a voice so ordinary in its tone that it took a moment to register how extraordinary the words were, "We have been talking about Holy Week. Let us remember what it is actually about." 16 words, no theological framing, no prepared opening prayer from the booklet that sat untouched in front of several people in the room. 16 words delivered as a simple factual observation, and then silence again. But a different kind of silence this time. The silence of people who have been reminded of something they believed they already knew, and have just understood that knowing and remembering are not the same thing. The meeting that followed lasted more than 2 hours. Everyone who was present would later describe it as different from ordinary Vatican meetings in a quality they found difficult to specify but impossible to miss. Less procedural padding, more directness. The kind of conversation that happens in institutions when the person leading it has recently made clear, without saying so, that performance is not the point. When the discussion turned to the foot-washing ceremony of Holy Thursday, the liturgical officer walked through the selection process. 14 people had been identified through a multi-department process involving considerable coordination. They were diverse in nationality and background. They had been chosen thoughtfully. The Pope listened for a few minutes. Then he asked, "Are any of them living on the street right now?" The question moved through the room like a current. The honest answer was no. The 14 people selected were appropriate, representative, and entirely appropriate in every institutional sense of the word. None of them was homeless. None of them was sleeping rough. None of them was carrying the specific, concentrated vulnerability of a person who had nowhere to go at the end of the night. Leo XIV did not raise his voice. He said, "Find me people who have nowhere to sleep. Those are the feet I want to wash on Thursday." Not a suggestion. Not a prompt for a working group to explore options. A conclusion, delivered with the quietness of someone who has already done the interior work that most institutions ask to defer to committee. The meeting adjusted around it, the way water adjusts around a stone, and moved on. The story left the room before the afternoon was over. The Vatican is a place where important things are supposed to stay contained and rarely do, and the story of what happened in the Sala del Consistoro on the morning of March 20th was the kind of story that moves because it contains something true, and true things move in the way that manufactured things do not. By early afternoon it had appeared on a Catholic news service. By evening it had been picked up internationally. By midnight it was on front pages in 5 countries. The responses divided along the lines that the past 10 months had established. Those who had hoped that this pontificate would carry the pastoral directness of recent years, while adding the structural seriousness that seemed built into this particular man found in the morning's events, something that felt like confirmation. A pope who makes real decisions in the rooms where decisions are made, without cameras, without announcements, without requiring the world to witness his humility in order for the humility to count. Those who were worried found their worry more precisely articulated. A pope who changes the guest list for Holy Thursday based on who is sleeping outside is a pope operating from a set of priorities that institutional process cannot easily redirect. The quiet firmness that his supporters experienced as spiritual authority was exactly what his critics experienced, as the thing most resistant to the kind of managed deceleration they believed the institution required. Cardinal Filippo Carnevali, a prominent figure in the curial conservative bloc, placed phone calls that evening. The contents were not known, but the people he called were seen moving through the palazzo corridors afterward, with the particular briskness of people who have received information that has changed their assessment of how fast they need to move. The following morning, Leo XIV arrived at a diocesan reception facility on the edge of Rome's outer ring. No announcement, no press advisory, an unremarkable car, 2 security staff, his personal secretary. He was dressed in dark civilian trousers and a plain clerical shirt. No white cassock, no pectoral cross visible, no visual marker of office beyond what anyone who knew his face would recognize. The young man at the gate had not recognized the face. Not until a security officer showed a discreet identification card. The young man, Eritrean, 14 months in Italy, in the particular limbo of the asylum process, later told a journalist that the man at the door had asked, in Italian, if he could come in. Simply asked, as though the answer might genuinely be no. Inside, approximately 160 people were eating breakfast. The facility served migrants and asylum seekers, people at various points in the administrative process that determined whether Italy would recognize their claim to safety. The room had the particular quality of places that are doing necessary work on insufficient resources, clean, functional, slightly worn, managed by people who understood that what they were providing was not a service, but a form of dignity maintenance. Leo walked through the room. He did not address the group. He did not organize a photograph. He stopped at tables and spoke in the languages he had. Italian, Spanish, the few phrases of Arabic he had been learning for months with a deliberateness that those around him had noted, but he had not publicized. At one table, a woman from Sudan showed him a photograph on her phone. Her daughter, still in Khartoum. He held the phone and looked at the photograph for a long time. When he handed it back, he said something. The woman could not quote it precisely when she was asked later. She said it had not felt like a consolation. It had felt like recognition. He helped clear one table. He shook hands and embraced people. Near a corner of the room, an older man sat alone in a wheelchair, his head slightly bowed, clearly in prayer. Leo moved to him without announcement, lowered himself beside the wheelchair, and was still. No words passed between them that anyone heard. 90 seconds, perhaps a little more. Then Leo rose, put his hand briefly over the man's hand and moved on. The room stayed quiet for a long time after he left. A volunteer worker had her phone in her apron pocket. She was not a press photographer. She was not documenting the visit in any official capacity. But she had a phone, and she used it instinctively, in the way that people use phones when they are witnessing something they want to be able to remember later. The images she took were not composed. They were honest. The Pope at a breakfast table with a young man whose hands were moving as he talked. The Pope kneeling by the wheelchair. The Pope standing in the doorway of the facility at the moment of his arrival, one hand on the doorframe, looking into the room with an expression that was not pity. The word for that expression The one several people reached for independently when they tried to describe it was attention. Total, unhurried, undivided attention. The kind that costs something to give, and that the people receiving it tend to remember for the rest of their lives. Those images were the ones that traveled. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true in the specific way that undirected photographs are sometimes true in ways that directed ones cannot be. The Vatican issued 3 sentences confirming the visit and describing it as a private pastoral encounter. The brevity of the statement was itself legible to anyone who had been watching this pontificate. He had not gone to be visible. He had gone because the Church, as he understood it, belonged in that room. The Italian government's response was swift and pointed. Several officials from the ruling coalition described the visit as pastoral gesture that should not be confused with policy commentary. The opposition said it was exactly policy commentary and welcomed it. The debate that followed was framed as a domestic political argument about migration, which was accurate, and missed the point entirely, which is also accurate. Inside the Vatican, the internal temperature was rising in the specific way that institutional temperatures rise when the person at the center is moving faster than the institution is designed to accommodate. A source speaking without attribution to a senior Vatican correspondent described an internal tension between those who understood the Pope's actions as spiritual renewal and those who believed the institutional Church required what the source called a more measured expression of pastoral priorities. Measured expression of pastoral priorities. 14 syllables that mean, in the diplomatic grammar of curial self-protection, he is doing too much of what he means. Leo, when briefed on the language in the correspondence report, read it once. Set it aside. Did not comment. His secretary, present, noted that he appeared neither surprised nor troubled. He appeared to have expected precisely this, and to have already made his decision about it. That evening, in the private chapel where the day had begun, the Pope was in prayer for what those around him estimated at close to 2 hours. The palace had wound down around him. The phones had quieted. The last of the briefings had been delivered. Rome outside the high windows was doing what it always does at night, glittering in its ancient, indifferent way. The accumulated light of a city that has been lit continuously for longer than most of the ideas currently being argued over inside its buildings. He was alone. Whatever was happening in that chapel was happening in a language that the institution outside its walls could not read and could not enter, which was perhaps its purpose. But 2 things had already happened that could not be undone. In the Sala del Consistoro, on a stone floor, a man in a position of extraordinary institutional authority had gone to his knees without announcement, without audience, without the framework of ceremony that converts private acts into public symbols. He had done it in front of 14 people who had not expected it, and who had, by all accounts, been quietly changed by it. The stone floor had borne that weight. The painted ceiling had looked down at it. And the 14 people who had been in the room had gone back to their offices carrying something in them that had not been there when they arrived. In a facility on the edge of the city, a woman from Sudan still had the photograph of her daughter. An Eritrean man at a gate was going to tell the story of the visitor who asked permission to enter. An elderly man in a wheelchair had been knelt beside in silence by someone who asked nothing of him and gave him 90 seconds of complete presence. Those things were finished. They existed now in the permanent category of things that have happened. No institutional recalibration, no carefully worded diplomatic statement, no meeting between concerned cardinals in evening corridors could reach back and undo them. And this is the thing about the way this particular pope seemed to understand his work, and perhaps the thing that most unsettled the people for whom institutional authority is the primary frame through which all other things are understood. The acts that mattered were not the announced ones. They were not the scheduled ones or the coordinated ones or the ones that produced official photographs and press releases in 3 languages. They were the ones in the silence before anyone was watching. The kneeling on a cold floor. The hand placed on an old man's hand in a corner of a room in a facility that does not appear in any Vatican itinerary. The long look at a photograph of a child in Khartoum. An institution that has, across 20 centuries, confused magnificence with holiness, splendor with sanctity, the quality of the vestments with the quality of the vocation, still finds itself stopped by the simple act of a man who means what he does when he kneels. There is something in that worth considering, maybe worth sitting with quietly, the way he sits with things, before the noise of the world arrives and covers it over. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear something true today.